Welcome to History Secret Wars, the channel where we ignore the official press releases of the past to read the secret ledgers of the dead. We uncover the wars fought not for flags, but for resources. Today, we are taking you to the frozen forests of the Ardennes in December 1944. You know this as the Battle of the Bulge. You have been told it was Hitler's last stand, a fanatical attempt to capture Antwerp and split the Allied armies. But that is only the cover story. The truth is far more pathetic and far more terrifying. By Christmas 1944, the Third Reich was not just losing, it was suffocating. It was a high-tech war machine that had run out of the one thing it needed to move: oil. The Battle of the Bulge was not a military campaign in the traditional sense. It was a heist. It was an armed robbery conducted by a desperate junkie looking for a fix. The objective wasn't land. It was the millions of gallons of gasoline sitting in American jerrycans behind the lines. Today, we reveal the story of the Christmas gamble. The secret war for fuel that turned the white snow of Belgium black with soot and red with blood. To understand the madness of December 1944, we must first look at the dashboard of the Nazi war machine. It was flashing red. Since 1939, Germany had been fighting a war it could not afford energetically. They had no natural oil reserves. They relied on imports from Romania and a complex industry of synthetic fuel, turning coal into gasoline. But by late 1944, the American Air Force had bombed the synthetic plants into rubble. The Red Army had seized the Romanian oil fields of Ploiești. The veins of the Reich had been cut. Adolf Hitler, hiding in his bunker, trembling from Parkinson's and drug withdrawal, looked at the maps. His generals, von Rundstedt and Model, told him the truth. Mein Führer, the tanks have fuel for 100 kilometers, maybe 150. After that, they are just steel bunkers. Hitler's response was the logic of a gambler who has lost his house and puts his last watch on the table. He conceived Operation Watch on the Rhine. The plan was to punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, race across the Meuse River, and capture the port of Antwerp. The generals were horrified. It was geographically impossible. It was logistically suicidal. But Hitler had a secret card. He pointed to the map, tapping on the American supply depots. "We don't need to bring fuel," he said. "We will take theirs." Think about the audacity of that. The plan relied on the enemy providing the gas for the invasion. It was like a bank robber entering a vault with an empty gun, planning to steal bullets from the guards to shoot them. The Wehrmacht amassed 200,000 men, thousands of artillery pieces, and the cream of the panzer divisions, the 6th Panzer Army. These were the heavy hitters. The King Tigers, the Panthers, massive beasts of steel that consumed 500 gallons of fuel just to start up. They siphoned fuel from every other front. They drained the tanks of the training schools. They left the Luftwaffe grounded to fill the bellies of the panzers. They scraped together enough fuel for exactly 96 hours of combat. 4 days. If they didn't capture American fuel dumps within 4 days, the entire offensive would grind to a halt. The master race was operating on a 0-hour timeline. The date was set for mid-December. Why? Because the meteorologists predicted a heavy storm. General Winter would ground the Allied Air Force. The Americans wouldn't be able to see the heist coming, and more importantly, it was Christmas. The psychological impact of attacking during the holiday of peace would add to the shock. As the Ghost Army assembled in the dark pine forests of the Eifel Mountains, under the strictest radio silence, the drivers were given a chilling order. Do not idle your engines. Do not warm them up. Every drop is precious. They sat in the freezing cold, waiting for the signal to launch the greatest armed robbery in history. The stage was set. The stakes were total. Victory or total collapse, and the fuel gauge was hovering just above empty. While the German war machine was scraping the bottom of its fuel barrels, on the other side of the line, the American army was preparing for a very different kind of winter. The Ardennes sector was known as the Ghost Front. It was quiet. It was where the American commanders sent exhausted units to rest and green units to learn the ropes. The terrain, hilly, forested, with narrow winding roads, was considered unsuitable for tanks. Allied intelligence, blinded by overconfidence, believed the Germans were finished. They believed the war would be over by Christmas. In the trenches, American GIs were decorating pine trees with tinfoil. They were trading cigarettes for eggs with local Belgian farmers. The post office was overwhelmed with packages from home, fruitcakes, warm socks, and letters dreaming of the post-war world. They had no idea that just a few miles away, in the fog, the barrels of 1,000 Tiger tanks were elevating, aiming directly at their dugouts. But Hitler knew that brute force wasn't enough. He needed chaos. He needed to paralyze the American response time so his tanks could race to the fuel dumps before the Americans could blow them up. To do this, he unleashed his favorite special agent, Otto Skorzeny, the man with the scar-faced grin who had rescued Mussolini. Hitler gave Skorzeny a mission straight out of a spy thriller, Operation Griffin. The plan was to create a Trojan horse unit. Skorzeny recruited English-speaking German soldiers. They were given captured American jeeps, Sherman tanks, and thousands of American uniforms stripped from POWs and the dead. Their mission was to infiltrate behind American lines, change road signs, cut telephone wires, and spread rumors. They were to act like retreating Americans, creating traffic jams that would block the reinforcements. Skorzeny's men were drilled in American slang. They learned how to open a pack of cigarettes like a GI, how to chew gum, how to swear properly. But the training was rushed. Many of them spoke English with heavy accents. Their uniforms were a mix of mismatched kit. It was a desperate improvisation, mirroring the entire offensive. But the psychological impact was devastating. Even before the first shot was fired, rumors of German assassins in American uniforms began to spread. Meanwhile, the main German force was waiting for the weather. On December 15th, the fog rolled in. A thick, heavy blanket that grounded the terrifying American fighter bombers, the Jabos. Hitler looked at the sky and declared it the weather of the Führer. The fuel trucks were positioned right behind the assault tanks. They were called the milch cows. But these cows were skinny. The commanders of the panzer divisions, men like Sepp Dietrich and Hasso von Manteuffel, looked at their logistics officers with dread. They knew the math. "We have to reach the Meuse River in 48 hours, they said. "If we get stuck in traffic, we are dead. If we don't find gasoline, we are dead." The entire operation was built on a best-case scenario that never happens in war. On the night of December 15th, the American soldiers in the Ardennes went to sleep in their foxholes. The silence was heavy. The snow was falling softly. It was the perfect picture of a Christmas card. Then, at 5:30 a.m. on December 16th, the world ended. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The ground shook as if an earthquake had hit Belgium. The Ghost Front vanished in a wall of fire and steel. The Ghost Army emerged from the mist. The American frontline units, the 99th and the 106th Infantry Divisions, were shattered. Young boys who had never seen combat were suddenly facing the elite veterans of the Eastern Front. The heist had begun. The burglars had kicked down the front door. But the vault was still far away, and the getaway car was already running low on gas. But to understand the true terror of this heist, we must follow the spearhead, the unit designated to drive the fastest, kill the hardest, and capture the fuel at all costs. This was Kampfgruppe Peiper. If the Ardennes Offensive was a robbery, Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper was the lead gangster. Young, handsome in a terrifying way, and utterly fanatical, Peiper was the poster boy of the Waffen-SS. He had served as Himmler's adjutant. He had burned villages in Russia. He fought with a brutality that ignored the laws of war. And he was chosen to lead the Leibstandarte, the tip of the spear of the 6th Panzer Army. His orders were simple and brutal. Speed. Ignore your flanks. Ignore prisoners. Ignore civilians. Just drive. Your objective is the bridges over the Meuse. Your lifeline is the American fuel. Peiper's column was a monster. It was 25 kilometers long. It contained the heaviest tanks in the world, the King Tigers. These 70-ton beasts were invincible from the front, but they were logistical nightmares. They drank fuel like water. In the steep, icy hills of the Ardennes, their consumption doubled. On the morning of December 17th, Peiper's column was already behind schedule. The narrow roads were clogged with retreating Americans and fleeing civilians. The blitzkrieg was turning into a traffic jam. Peiper was furious. He stood in his command vehicle, screaming at his drivers to run over obstacles. He knew his fuel gauge was dropping. Every minute stopped was a gallon wasted. This frustration, this desperate race against the needle on the dashboard, created a psychological pressure cooker that would explode in violence. At a crossroads near the village of Malmedy, Peiper's lead units ran into a convoy of the American 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion. It was a short fight. The Americans, lightly armed, surrendered. About 120 American prisoners were gathered in a snowy field. They stood with their hands up, shivering in the cold, waiting for trucks to take them to the rear. But Peiper didn't have trucks to spare. He didn't have fuel to transport prisoners. And he didn't have time. What happened next is a matter of debate, but the result is not. The SS troopers opened fire. Machine guns mowed down the unarmed men. Those who survived the initial volley were shot in the head as they lay in the snow. It was the Malmedy massacre. To the world, this was a war crime of unspeakable evil. And it was. But in the context of the secret war for fuel, it was also a symptom of the German desperation. Prisoners were a logistical burden. The SS had decided to liquidate the burden to keep the wheels moving. Word of the massacre spread like wildfire through the American lines. "They are shooting prisoners." This changed the nature of the battle. The American resistance hardened. GIs who might have surrendered now fought to the death. No SS prisoners became the unofficial order of the U.S. Army. The heist had turned into a blood feud. Piper pushed on, leaving the bodies in the snow. He was obsessed with one thing: the massive American fuel depot at Bullingen. When his tanks rolled into Bullingen, they captured a small airfield. They found 50,000 gallons of fuel. It was a lifeline. Piper forced the captured American POWs to refuel his tanks at gunpoint. It was a humiliation for the U.S. Army. Their own gas was now powering the tanks that were killing them. But 50,000 gallons was just a snack for a King Tiger. It wasn't enough to reach Antwerp. Piper needed the main course. He needed the millions of gallons stored near the town of Stavelot. He looked at his maps. He was close. The prize was just a few miles away. But the Americans were waking up. Engineers were rushing to the bridges with dynamite. The race for the black gold was entering its critical phase. But as Piper closed in on the prize, a wall of fire was about to rise. Next, we witnessed the mirage of Stavelot and the bonfire that burned the German dream to ash. December 18, 1924. The town of Stavelot. Kampfgruppe Piper was winding its way down the narrow valley of the Amblev River. The King Tigers were sliding on the icy cobblestones. Their engines were coughing. The fuel captured at Bullingen was almost gone. Piper's eyes were fixed on the map. Just north of Stavelot, near the road to Spa, lay the greatest prize of the entire offensive, the First Army fuel dump, 3 million gallons of gasoline, stacked in miles of jerrycans along the roadside. It was enough fuel to power his panzers all the way to Antwerp and back. It was enough to change the course of the war. But standing between Piper and the fuel was a small, ragtag group of American combat engineers and a few tank destroyers. Major Paul Solis, commanding the defense, knew he couldn't stop the Tigers. His guns would bounce off their armor. But he had orders. Do not let them take the fuel. As the German tanks approached the bridge at Stavelot, the American engineers blew it. But the Germans found another way. They were relentless. They pushed into the town. The fighting was house to house. Major Solis realized the Germans were breaking through. He looked at the mountain of gasoline cans behind him. He knew what he had to do. It was the most painful order a logistician can give: burn it. The Americans poured gasoline over the road. They created a trench of fuel, and they threw a match. When Piper's lead tanks came around the corner, they didn't face an anti-tank gun. They faced a wall of fire. A literal river of burning gasoline was flowing down the road towards them. The German tank commanders popped their hatches, choking on the smoke. They watched, helpless, as the very thing they had invaded to steal was consumed by flames. The black gold turned into black smoke. It was the turning point of the heist. The robbers had reached the vault, cracked the safe, and found the money burning. Piper was furious. He tried to bypass the fire, to find another route to the rest of the dump, but the delay was fatal. The American reinforcements were arriving. The 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, was digging in. Without that fuel, Piper's blitzkrieg stalled. His tanks were now running on fumes. He had pushed deep into enemy territory, creating a long, thin finger of a salient. But a finger can be cut off. The Americans blew the bridges behind him. Then they blew the bridges in front of him. Kampfgruppe Piper was trapped in the valley of the Amblev. The hunters became the hunted. Trapped in the valley, Piper's men began to scavenge. They siphoned fuel from abandoned American trucks. They checked the tanks of destroyed jeeps. It was pathetic. The elite of the Aryan race were reduced to siphoning gas like common thieves. Meanwhile, to the south, another drama was unfolding. The main German body was stuck. They needed the road network centered on a small, insignificant market town called Bastogne. Hitler had ordered, take Bastogne or bypass it, but keep moving. But the Panzer Lehr Division couldn't bypass it. The mud was too deep. They needed the paved roads. And holding Bastogne was the 101st Airborne Division. The Screaming Eagles. They were surrounded. They were outgunned. They had no winter clothes. And they were running out of ammunition. It was a siege of two starving armies. The Germans starving for fuel outside the ring, the Americans starving for bullets inside the ring. And the weather was still on Hitler's side. The fog was so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. The American supplies couldn't be dropped by air. The German tanks couldn't be bombed. It was a frozen cage match in the dark. But in the German high command, the panic was setting in. The 96-hour timetable had expired. The fuel reserves were at zero. The heist had failed. Now, it was just a matter of how many men they could save before the police arrived. But the police were already there, and his name was George S. Patton. The heist had failed, but the police were closing in. And the sheriff was George S. Patton. Next, we revealed the prayer for weather and the logistical miracle that turned an entire army 90 degrees to smash the German flank. While Piper was watching the fuel burn in Stavelot, the heart of the battle shifted to Bastogne. This crossroads town was the cork in the bottle. 7 major roads met here. The Germans needed these roads to move their supply trucks. Without Bastogne, their offensive was just a traffic jam in the mud. Inside the perimeter, the 101st Airborne was freezing. They had rushed to the front in open trucks, wearing summer uniforms. They had no medical supplies. They were low on ammo. They were completely surrounded by the Panzer Lehr and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The German commander, General von Lüttwitz, sent a message under a white flag. It was a formal demand for surrender. He appealed to the Americans' humanity to save them from total annihilation. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the note. He was tired, cold, and unimpressed. He crumpled the paper and muttered a single word, "Nuts." When the German officers asked for the official reply, that was what they got. To the German commander, "Nuts." From the American commander, the Germans were confused. "Is this negative or affirmative?" they asked. The American interpreter smiled grimly. In plain English, it means, "Go to hell." This story is legendary. But here is the secret war angle. McAuliffe could say nuts because he knew something the Germans didn't. He knew that the German annihilation threat was a bluff. The Germans didn't have the fuel to maneuver for a proper siege. They didn't have the fuel to bring up their heavy siege artillery quickly enough. They were sitting ducks, burning precious gas, just idling their engines to keep the crews from freezing to death. Every day the 101st held out was another day the German tanks weren't moving towards Antwerp. Bastogne was the anchor that dragged the whole Nazi ship to a halt. Meanwhile, to the south, General George S. Patton was performing a miracle. Patton realized the danger immediately. He didn't ask for permission. He acted. In 48 hours, he pulled the Third Army out of combat in the Saar, turned them 90 degrees north, and drove them 100 miles through a blizzard to hit the German flank. This maneuver required millions of gallons of gasoline, and unlike the Germans, Patton had it. The Red Ball Express, the massive truck convoy system of the U.S. Army, was working overtime. This is the ultimate contrast of the battle. The Germans were scavenging for drops of fuel. The Americans were burning it by the tanker load just to reposition an army. It wasn't a battle of courage. It was a battle of logistics. Patton famously ordered his chaplain to write a prayer for weather. He wanted the fog to lift so the Air Force could kill the German tanks. He printed 250,000 copies of the prayer and gave it to every soldier. "Sir, this is not a customary practice," the chaplain said. "Do I look like I care about custom?" Patton replied. "I want to kill Germans." And then, on December 23rd, the miracle happened. The barometric pressure shifted. A cold, high-pressure front moved in from Russia. The wind stopped. The clouds broke. The sun came out. The sky over the Ardennes turned a brilliant, piercing blue. And in that blue sky, thousands of silver specks appeared. The heist was over. The SWAT team had arrived. Next, we look up. We witness the day of the Jabos as the sky opens to rain fire upon the trapped panzers. The weather, which had been Hitler's only ally, had just betrayed him. Christmas Eve, 1944. For the German tankers sitting in their King Tigers and Panthers, the clear blue sky was the most terrifying sight in the world. They looked up and saw the end of the Third Reich descending on wings. The Allied air forces, the USAAF and the RAF, launched the largest air sorting of the war. C-47 transport planes dropped thousands of tons of supplies into Bastogne. The Americans inside celebrated with K rations and ammo. But for the Germans, the sky brought fire. The P-47 Thunderbolts and British Typhoons swooped down like hawks. They weren't just bombing tanks, they were hunting the supply trucks. They strafed the roads. They bombed the railheads. Remember, the Germans were already critically low on fuel. Now, The fuel trucks that were trying to reach the front were exploding in balls of fire. The umbilical cord of the offensive was cut. The German tanks became steel coffins. A King Tiger without gas is just a 70-ton roadblock. The crews sat inside, watching their gauges hit zero. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't retreat. They were sitting ducks. Piper, the leader of the Heist, was now totally cut off in the village of La Glaise. He had no fuel. He had no ammo. He had hundreds of wounded men. The Americans were closing in from all sides. On Christmas Eve, Piper made a decision that symbolized the total failure of the operation. He ordered his men to destroy their equipment. The pride of the German army, the mighty King Tigers, the Panthers, the half-tracks, were rigged with explosives. One by one, they were blown up. Not by enemy fire, but by their own crews. Piper and 800 of his men abandoned their vehicles and walked out into the snow. They left behind the wounded who couldn't walk. They slipped through the American lines on foot, like ghosts, leaving the spearhead rusting in the Belgian mud. The Christmas gamble had turned into a Christmas massacre, but Hitler refused to give up. From his bunker, detached from reality, he ordered the attacks to continue. "We must hold!" he screamed. "We will find fuel!" He launched Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, a desperate air attack on Allied airfields. It was a suicide mission for the Luftwaffe. They destroyed some Allied planes, but they lost hundreds of their own pilots they could never replace. It was the last gasp of the German Air Force. The Battle of the Bulge continued into January, but the outcome was decided the moment the first tank ran dry. The Americans began to push the Bulge back. They found roads lined with abandoned German equipment. Pristine tanks, fully armed, but with empty fuel tanks. It was a graveyard of ambition. The secret war revealed a brutal truth. You can have the best engineers, the best generals, and the most fanatical soldiers, but if you don't have the geology, if you don't have the oil, you are nothing. The Christmas gamble had turned into a massacre, but the snow hides many secrets. Next, we walked the long road home to uncover the trail of frozen iron and the horrific atrocities left behind by a desperate SS. January 1945. The party was over. The hangover was lethal. The retreat from the Ardennes was a scene from Dante's Inferno, frozen over. The German army was not marching, it was limping. The roads back to Germany were glazed with ice. Horses, used to pull artillery because there was no gas for trucks, collapsed and died in the traces. Soldiers cut chunks of meat from the dead horses to eat raw. The equipment loss was catastrophic. The Germans lost over 600 tanks and assault guns. Not because they were destroyed in battle. Many were abandoned simply because they ran out of gas. Think about the economics of that. A King Tiger cost 800,000 Reichsmarks and took 300,000 man-hours to build. And it was left in a ditch because of a lack of $50 worth of gasoline. It was the ultimate bankruptcy of the Nazi system. As the Americans advanced, they uncovered the horror of the occupation. They found the bodies of the 84 prisoners at Malmedy, preserved in the snow like wax figures. They found civilians, Belgian men, women, and children, murdered by the SS in Stavelot and other villages. These atrocities were not random acts of violence. They were the product of the resource stress. When an army is starving and immobile, it turns on the population. The frustration of the failed heist was taken out on the innocent. The Americans were unforgiving. The rage over Malmedy meant that many SS soldiers trying to surrender were shot on sight. The war had lost any semblance of chivalry. It was a war of extermination. For Hitler, the gamble had failed in the worst possible way. He had not only failed to capture the fuel, he had burned up his last reserves trying to get it. The 6th Panzer Army, his strategic reserve, the force he needed to defend Berlin from the Russians, was shattered. It had been fed into the wood chipper of the Ardennes. When the Russians launched their massive offensive on the Vistula River in mid-January, the German front in the east collapsed like wet paper. There were no tanks left to stop them. They were all rusting in Belgium. The Christmas gamble didn't just fail to win the war in the west, it accelerated the defeat in the east. By trying to steal American gas, Hitler had opened the door for the Russian bear. But there is one final, secret layer to this story, a technological twist hidden in the molecules themselves. Next, we enter the chemist war to explore the fatal flaw of the vampire blood that failed the Wehrmacht. Throughout this series, we've said Germany ran out of oil. But wait, didn't Germany have the most advanced chemical industry in the world? Didn't they invent the Burgius process, turning coal into liquid fuel? Yes, they did. IG Farben, the industrial giant, built massive hydrogenation plants like Luna and Politz. These were the beating hearts of the Nazi war effort. By 1944, they were producing millions of barrels of synthetic fuel. So why did the tanks stop in the Ardennes? Because the Allies waged a secret war against chemistry. General Karl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. Strategic Air Forces, realized in 1944 that bombing cities was a waste of time. He switched targets. He ordered his bombers to hit the oil plants. It was a surgical assassination of the German energy grid. Every time the Germans repaired a pipe at Leuna, the bombers returned. Production plummeted by 90% in 6 months. But there was another problem. Synthetic fuel was inferior. German ersatz petrol had a lower octane rating than the refined American gasoline. It was prone to freezing. It clogged engines. It required additives that were becoming rare. In the extreme cold of the Ardennes, minus 20 degrees Celsius, the synthetic oil turned into sludge. The German mechanics had to light fires under the tanks just to warm the oil enough to start the engines. This wasted even more fuel. Meanwhile, the Americans were running on high-grade, 100-octane aviation fuel and standardized gasoline. Their supply chain was a pipeline of liquid power stretching from Texas to the foxholes of Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge was the final proof that ersatz, fake, resources cannot beat real ones. You can print money, but you can't print energy. The German scientists had performed miracles. They had kept the war going for 5 years without a single oil field. But in the end, chemistry lost to geology. And the result was the frozen silence of the King Tiger tanks. Chemistry lost to geology. But the final nail in the coffin was hammered in by a relentless conveyor belt of trucks. Next, we reveal the pipeline of victory and the unsung heroes of the Red Ball Express. While the Germans were counting drops of fuel with an eyedropper, the Americans were creating a river. The unsung hero of the Battle of the Bulge wasn't a tank commander or a paratrooper. It was a truck driver, usually an African-American truck driver. The Red Ball Express was the most massive logistical operation in history. It was a conveyor belt of trucks running 24/7 from the ports of Normandy to the front lines. Drivers were ordered to ignore speed limits. They drove until they fell asleep at the wheel. They removed the governors from their engines. They carried millions of tons of supplies. During the Battle of the Bulge, when Patton turned his army north, he needed 350,000 gallons of gas per day. The Red Ball Express delivered it. They drove through blizzards. They drove through artillery fire. They drove on roads mined by Skorzeny's commandos. This was the American superpower. It wasn't just that they had better tanks. They didn't. The Sherman was inferior to the Tiger. It was that they had more of everything, and they could get it to the right place at the right time. The Germans looked at captured American supply trucks with envy and disbelief. They found fresh cakes from Boston. They found dry socks. They found unlimited cigarettes. One German officer wrote in his diary, "We are fighting an army that treats war like a delivery service. They order a victory, and it is delivered by truck the next morning." The Battle of the Bulge proved that amateurs talk strategy, but professionals talk logistics. Hitler's gamble failed because he ignored the boring reality of truck tires and fuel pumps. He bet on willpower and destiny. Eisenhower and Patton bet on the Red Ball Express. As the battle ended in late January 1945, the road to the Rhine was open. The fuel that Piper had tried to steal was now being pumped into the tanks that would cross into Germany and end the Third Reich. The road to the Rhine was open. But the ghost of the Ardennes still haunts us. In our final dossier, we analyze the legacy of the Heist and why the secret war for resources remains the blueprint for modern conflict. January 25, 1945. The Battle of the Bulge is officially over. The lines are back to where they started. The cost? 90,000 American casualties. 100,000 German casualties. A beautiful region of Belgium destroyed. And for what? Hitler's Christmas gamble achieved nothing. It didn't capture the fuel. It didn't split the Allies. It didn't save the Reich. Instead, it burned up the last reserves of the German military. It was a fire sale of the Wehrmacht. After the Bulge, the German army was a hollow shell. They had no fuel to train new pilots. They had no fuel to move divisions. The war dragged on for another 4 months, but the German army was effectively walking home. When the Allies finally crossed the Rhine and entered Germany, they found thousands of aircraft sitting on runways, undamaged but grounded. They found tanks abandoned in factories. The machine was intact, but the blood was gone. The secret war for fuel teaches us a terrifying lesson. Nations will do desperate, irrational things when they run out of energy. They will launch suicide missions. They will break treaties. They will sacrifice their own armies for a chance to seize resources. Look at the world today. We still fight wars for pipelines. We still secure oil fields with armies. The vampire economy is still alive. The rusted hull of a King Tiger tank still sits in the town of La Gliese today. It is a monument, not to military glory, but to logistical failure. It is a reminder of the Christmas when the master race ran out of gas. History is often written by the victors, but the mechanics of history are written in the ledgers of resources. Thank you for joining us on this frozen journey through the Ardennes. If you want to understand the real reasons wars are won and lost, the money, the oil, the food, make sure you subscribe to History Secret Wars. Ring the bell. Share this video. Because the next shortage is coming, and history has a habit of repeating its worst desperate gambles. This is History Secret Wars. And remember, the tank is only as powerful as the fuel in its tank.